You know, after all these years, if there's one thing I've learned sitting across from thousands of people, it's that the truth rarely lives in the words people choose to say out loud. It lives in the spaces between those words. It lives in the way a daughter won't look her mother in the eye, or the way a father clenches his jaw when he's talking about love. People come on my stage because they want a referee, but what they usually need is a mirror. They want me to tell them they're right, that they're the victim, and that the person sitting next to them is the one who's broken. But I've been doing this long enough to know that when someone tells me they've done everything right and yet everything is falling apart, they're usually leaving out the most important chapter of the story. Take this case with Elena and her son Caleb. When I first read the production notes, it looked like a classic scenario of a parent at the end of her rope. Elena's email to us was a manifesto of motherly grief. She described a 24-year-old man who was aggressive, ungrateful, and seemingly hell-bent on destroying her peace of mind. She used all the buzzwords. She called him entitled, volatile, and toxic. She told my producers that she was terrified of him, that she had spent her life savings trying to fix him, and that she was finally ready to wash her hands of the problem she had birthed. On paper, Elena was a saint and Caleb was a monster. But as I sat in my dressing room looking at the pre-interview footage, I didn't see a monster. I saw a young man who looked like he had been hollowed out from the inside. And I saw a mother who was performing for the camera even when she thought nobody was watching. When I walked out onto that stage and saw them sitting there, the atmosphere was thick enough to cut with a knife. Elena was dressed to the nines, perfectly coiffed hair, a sensible suit, a string of pearls that she kept fingering nervously. She was sitting on the very edge of the chair, leaning toward me as if she were trying to pull me into her orbit. Caleb, on the other hand, was slumped. He was wearing an oversized hoodie, his eyes were fixed on the floor, and he had this heavy, leaden energy about him. It was the posture of someone who had already lost the fight before the first word was even spoken. Elena started talking before I even sat down. She began recounting a story from 3 nights prior where Caleb had supposedly erupted over a dinner choice, screaming at her until she had to lock herself in the bathroom. As she spoke, she began to cry right on cue. It was that soft, practiced sob that's designed to elicit sympathy rather than express genuine pain. I watched Caleb. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. He just sat there staring at his shoes, a faint, bitter smile touching the corners of his mouth. It was the smile of a man who had heard this script 1,000 times. I let her finish, and then I turned to him. I asked him, Caleb, is what your mother's saying true? Did you scream at her until she was forced to hide? He didn't look up. He just shrugged and said, if that's what she needs to believe, then sure. I'm the bad guy. I'm always the bad guy. That right there was my first real clue. When someone stops fighting the labels put on them, it's usually because they've realized that the truth doesn't matter in their environment. I turned back to Elena and I asked her a very simple question. I said, Elena, you say you're afraid of your son, but you're sitting 3 feet away from him and you haven't looked at him once since we started. You're looking at me. You're looking at the audience. Why is that? She blinked, her tears drying up instantly, and she gave me this look of pure confusion. She told me she was looking at me because I was the one who was supposed to help her fix him. But see, that's the thing about fixing people. You can't fix a person like they're a broken appliance. You have to understand the system they're operating in. I began to dig into their history, moving past the surface level complaints about messy rooms and missed curfews. I wanted to know how they got here. I wanted to know about the house Caleb grew up in. Elena described it as a house of love and high standard. She told me she had sacrificed everything for him after his father left when he was 5. She painted a picture of a devoted single mother who did it all. But when I pushed a little harder, asking about the high standards, the story started to shift. Caleb finally spoke up then. His voice was quiet, but it had a rasp to it, like he hadn't used it in a long time. He started talking about the performance of their lives. He told me that growing up, his mother didn't just want him to be good, she wanted him to look perfect to the neighbors, to the church, to her friends. He described a childhood where his every move was scrutinized, not for his own well-being, but for how it reflected on her. If he got a B on a test, it wasn't a learning opportunity, it was a betrayal of her hard work. If he wanted to play football instead of the violin, it was an attack on her vision for their family. I looked at Elena as he spoke, and I saw the mask slip for just a second. Her face didn't show concern or sadness, it showed irritation. She wasn't listening to what he was saying, she was waiting for him to finish so she could rebut it. I've seen this pattern a million times. It's a form of emotional enmeshment where the parent sees the child as an extension of themselves rather than a separate human being. In Elena's mind, Caleb wasn't a son, he was a trophy. And because that trophy had a few cracks in it, she wanted to return it or have it polished until it shone again. I asked her, Elena, did you ever just let him be a kid? Or was he always an employee in the business of making you look good? She got defensive then. She started talking about how hard she worked, how she held down 2 jobs, how she never went on dates so she could focus on him. She was playing the martyr card, which is the strongest card in the deck for a certain type of parent. It's designed to shut down all criticism. Because how can you criticize someone who has given up everything for you? It creates a debt that can never be repaid, and that debt is a leash that keeps the child tethered to the parent's expectations forever. I looked back at Caleb. I could see the weight of that debt on his shoulders. He had spent 24 years trying to pay back a loan he never asked for. He told me about the time he tried to move out when he was 21. He had saved up money from a landscaping job, found a small apartment with a friend, and was ready to go. He said the moment he told her, Elena didn't congratulate him. She didn't tell him she was proud. Instead, she had a medical emergency. She claimed her heart was racing, that she couldn't breathe, that she was sure she was having a stroke because of the stress he was putting her under. He stayed. Of course he stayed. And that's when the eruption started. People think anger is always a bad thing, but sometimes anger is the only way a person knows how to scream, I'm still here, when they're being smothered. Caleb wasn't aggressive because he was a monster. He was aggressive because he was a caged animal. Every time he tried to assert his independence, Elena would pull the leash. She would use guilt, she would use shame, or she would use her own perceived fragility to keep him in place. And when he finally snapped and yelled, she would record it, she would tell her friends about it, she would use his reaction to her provocation as proof that he was the problem. I looked at the video clips Elena's production representative had handed over before the show. In them, Caleb is pacing the kitchen, his face flushed, his voice cracking as he screams, "Just leave me alone! Get away from me!" Elena is holding the camera, her phone, and her voice is a whisper, a calm, trembling contrast to his rage. She says, "Caleb, honey, look at how you're acting. I'm just trying to talk to you. Why are you being so mean to your mother?" To the casual observer, it looks like a mother being victimized by a runaway train of a son. But to me, someone who has spent 40 years looking at the mechanics of human behavior, that video was a crime scene of emotional baiting. I turned to Elena and I said, "You know, Elena, it's a funny thing about video. It only shows what the person holding the camera wants the world to see. Tell me what happened 10 minutes before you pressed record." She started to stammer. saying she was just asking him if he wanted some laundry done. But Caleb let out a dry, hollow laugh. He told me the truth of that afternoon. He had been on a job interview over the phone, his first real lead in months, and Elena had walked into the room 3 times, interrupting him, making noise in the background, and finally, when he asked her to please be quiet, she started telling him that he was acting superior and that he shouldn't forget who pays the phone bill. By the time the camera was rolling, he had been poked and prodded for 45 minutes. He wasn't having a random eruption. He was reacting to a systematic dismantling of his privacy and his dignity. This is what I call gaslighting in the first degree. It's a way of destabilizing someone so thoroughly that they begin to doubt their own reality. When you do that to a child from the time they are small, they don't grow up with a sense of self. They grow up with a sense of, what does mom need me to be today? And if the answer is the villain, they eventually step into that role because it's the only way to get the interaction to stop. Caleb had become the problem because it gave Elena a purpose. As long as he was broken, she could be the savior. As long as he was volatile, she could be the long-suffering saint. I leaned back and looked at the audience, then back at them. I said, we talk a lot about enabling in this country. Usually we mean giving an addict money or a place to stay. But there's a much more dangerous kind of enabling, and that's the enabling of a narrative. Elena, you have enabled a version of your son that is incompetent and dangerous, because if he ever actually got his act together, if he ever became a strong, independent man, he wouldn't need you anymore. And the idea of not being needed is more terrifying to you than the idea of your son being miserable. The room went dead silent. Elena's face hardened. That's the moment the sweet mother persona usually starts to crack. She didn't like being seen. She liked being heard, but she didn't like being scrutinized. She started to argue that I didn't understand the complexity of her sacrifice. She began listing the things she had bought him, the car, the clothes, the therapy sessions. I stopped her right there. I told her, you can't buy a relationship with things, and you can't use those things as a down payment on his soul. You gave him a car so he could drive to the places you wanted him to go. You paid for therapy so a professional would tell him he was the one who needed to change. You've been using your checkbook as a remote control. The escalation in their house hadn't been a sudden climb. It was a slow-motion car crash that had been happening for a decade. Caleb described the invisible strings that were attached to everything in his life. He wasn't allowed to have friends she didn't approve of. He wasn't allowed to have a bank account she couldn't monitor. Whenever he tried to pull away, the emergencies would start. Not just health scares, but financial crises or sudden, overwhelming bouts of depression that required him to sit by her side for hours. It was a hostage situation disguised as a family. I turned to Caleb. Caleb, why do you stay? You're 24 years old. You're a grown man. You've got 2 legs and a brain. Why are you still living in that basement, letting her record your worst moments like you're an animal in a zoo? He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw tears in his eyes. Real ones, not the performative ones Elena had been shedding. He said, because I feel like if I leave, I'm killing her. She told me since I was 10 years old that I was the only reason she was still alive. How do you walk away from that? How do you leave when you're told your independence is a death sentence for the person who gave you life? That is the ultimate guilt trap. It's a form of emotional incest that's more common than people think. It's when a parent uses a child to fill the emotional void left by a spouse, a career, or a lack of self-worth. Elena had made Caleb her emotional husband. She expected him to provide the validation, the attention, and the stability that she couldn't find within herself. And because he was a good kid, because he actually did love her, he allowed himself to be consumed by her needs. But you can only be consumed for so long before there's nothing left but ash and anger. The tension on the stage was vibrating. Elena was shaking her head, whispering no, no, no to herself. She was losing control of the narrative. And for someone like her, control is the only thing that keeps the world spinning. She tried one last time to pivot back to his aggression. She brought up a time he had punched a hole in a door. I looked at Caleb and asked him about the door. He admitted it. He said he was ashamed of it. But then he said, I punched that door because she wouldn't let me out of the room. She stood in front of the exit, screaming at me that I was a coward for trying to walk away from a conversation. I didn't want to hit her, Dr. Phil. I would never hit her. I just needed the air to move. I just needed to feel like I could break through something because I couldn't break through her. I've seen this 1,000 times. When people are trapped, they lash out. It doesn't make the violence right. I told him that in no uncertain terms, but it makes it understandable. You can't keep a lid on a boiling pot and then act surprised when the steam starts to hiss. I told Elena, you are the one who is stoking the fire under that pot, and then you're calling the fire department because it's hot in the kitchen. You can't have it both ways. I knew we were approaching a crossroads. We could either keep dancing around the he said, she said of their daily fights, or we could get down to the bone. I decided it was time to talk about the secondary gain. I asked Elena, what do you get out of him being a failure? What is the payoff for you? She looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. She insisted there was no payoff, that she only wanted him to be happy. But I pushed. If he's happy, he's gone. If he's successful, he's independent. If he's independent, you're alone in that big house with nothing but your own thoughts. And I think you're terrified of your own thoughts, Elena. I watched her for a long moment, letting that silence hang in the air like a heavy curtain. Elena didn't flinch, but her eyes were darting around, looking for an exit strategy. This is the part of the show that most people don't see, the psychological chess match that happens when a person's defense mechanisms are stripped bare. She wasn't just a mother in distress. She was a woman whose entire identity was built on being the good parent to a bad child. If I took away the bad child, who was she? She was a woman who hadn't had a hobby, a friend, or a purpose outside of managing her son's perceived failures in over a decade. I turned back to Caleb. I wanted to see if he was ready to own his part in this dance. Caleb, I said, leaning in, you've been complaining about the leash for 24 years, but let's be real here. Every time she holds it out, you put your head right back in the collar. Why? Is it because it's easier to be a victim than it is to be a man? Is it easier to blame her for your lack of a career, your lack of a social life, and your lack of a future than it is to walk out that door and fail on your own terms? That hit him hard. He winced like I'd slapped him, but that's the Dr. Phil reality check. You can't change what you don't acknowledge. I told him straight, you're using her behavior as an excuse for your own stagnation. Yes, she's overbearing. Yes, she's manipulative. But you're an accomplice in your own kidnapping. You've accepted the room, the board, the car, and the cell phone. And then you act surprised when she wants to check the data logs. You're trading your freedom for a free ride, and then you're mad because the ride isn't going where you want it to go. This is what I call the internalized victim syndrome. Caleb had spent so long being told he was the problem that he started to believe it, but he also started to use it. It's a dark, comfortable place to be because as long as you're the problem, no one expects anything from you. If you're broken, you don't have to compete in the real world. You don't have to risk rejection or failure. You can just sit in the basement and be volatile while mom pays the bills. It was a toxic, codependent loop that they had both perfected over 20 years. I looked at both of them and I said, you two are in a burning house and you're arguing about who left the stove on while the roof is falling in. Does it really matter whose fault it started out being? The point is, you're both going to burn to death emotionally if you don't get out. I turned my attention back to Elena because she was the architect of this particular house. I asked her about her own mother. I wanted to know where she learned that love was synonymous with control. She softened then, just a fraction. She told me about her own father, a man who was there one day and gone the next, leaving her mother to scramble and scrape for every penny. Her mother had been hard, cold, and demanding. Elena had spent her childhood trying to be perfect so her mother wouldn't have another reason to be unhappy. She had internalized the idea that if things aren't perfect, they're catastrophic. When her own husband walked out on her and Caleb, those old fears came roaring back. She wasn't just raising a son, she was trying to prevent a repeat of her own abandonment. I told her, Elena, you've been trying to protect Caleb from the world, but in doing so, you've become the thing he needs protection from. You're so afraid of being left alone that you're suffocating the only person who stayed. You think you're being a devoted mother, but what you're actually being is a jailer. And the more you tighten the grip, the more he's going to struggle to get away. That's why he's screaming. That's why he's punching doors. He's trying to breathe. The confrontation phase is always the most volatile because it requires people to give up their favorite lies. Elena's favorite lie was that she was a martyr. Caleb's favorite lie was that he was a helpless victim. I had to strip both away to get to the truth. I looked at Elena and said, I want you to look at your son, really look at him, and tell me, do you want a son or do you want a project? Because if you want a son, you have to let him grow up. And growing up means he gets to make mistakes that have nothing to do with you. It means he gets to move out and not call you for 3 days, and you don't get to have a heart attack about it. She started to cry again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the poor me sob. It was the sound of a woman who was realizing she had spent 20 years building a prison and calling it a home. She looked at Caleb, and for the first time on that stage, she actually saw him. Not the monster she described in her emails, but the lonely, frustrated young man who was just waiting for permission to exist. I turned to Caleb, and you need to grow some calluses on your soul. You've been so sensitive to her every mood that you've forgotten how to have a mood of your own. You need to stop asking for her permission to be an adult. Adults don't ask for permission. They take responsibility. You want to move out? Then move out. Don't wait for her to be okay with it. She's never going to be okay with it. You have to be okay with her not being okay. I've found that the biggest hurdle in family therapy isn't the presence of conflict, it's the absence of boundaries. These two didn't have a single boundary between them. They were like two colors of paint that had been mixed together for so long they had turned into a muddy, unrecognizable gray. Caleb didn't know where he ended, and Elena began. I asked them to do an exercise right there on the stage. I told them to stand up. I had them stand about 5 feet apart. I said, Elena, I want you to take one step back. She did, hesitantly. I said, Caleb, you take one step back. He did. I told them to keep doing it until they were at opposite ends of the stage. Now I said, look at that space between you. That's not a gap. That's not abandonment. That's respect. That's the space where a healthy relationship lives. You can't love someone if you're standing on their toes. You can't see someone if you're looking through their eyes. Elena was trembling. She said, it feels so far away. I feel like I'm losing him. I looked her right in the eye and said, you already lost him, Elena. You lost him to the anger, the resentment, and the role-playing. If you want him back, you have to let him go first. You have to trust that the job you did, even the messy, Controlling parts of it was enough to give him a foundation to stand on, but he can't stand on it if you're always holding his hand. We sat back down, and the energy in the room had shifted. It wasn't as heavy, but it was much more fragile. This is the breakthrough point where the choice has to be made. Are they going to go back to the hotel, get in the same car, and start the same old fight? Or are they going to choose a different path? I told them I was willing to provide the resources, the top-tier individual counseling, the transitional housing for Caleb, the support groups for Elena, but only if they were willing to sign a contract with themselves. I looked at that contract on the table between them. It wasn't just a piece of paper with some ink on it. It was a boundary line in the sand. I told them, this isn't about whether or not you love each other. We've established that. This is about whether or not you respect each other enough to let the other person breathe. I could see Elena staring at the pen as if it were a loaded weapon. To her, signing that meant agreeing to a world where she wasn't the center of Caleb's universe. It meant accepting that her little boy was a man who didn't belong to her anymore. And for Caleb, it meant giving up the safety net of his excuses. I told Caleb, the first thing that's going to happen when you leave this stage is you're going to feel a sense of relief. But about 3 hours from now, when you're sitting in that hotel room or heading to that transitional housing I've arranged, the guilt is going to start crawling up your spine. You're going to wonder if you were too hard on her. You're going to think about all those times she did take care of you, and you're going to want to pick up the phone and apologize. And I'm telling you right now, if you do that, you are resetting the clock to 0. You are telling her that your boundaries are negotiable. Then I turned to Elena, and you, Elena, you're going to have an attack tonight. Your chest is going to feel tight, or you're going to forget how to log into your bank account, or you're going to suddenly remember something urgent that Caleb needs to know. You're going to want to call him just to check in. But what you're really doing is testing the fence. You're like a prisoner who's lived in a cell so long she doesn't know how to walk in an open field. You've got to learn how to be Elena again, not just Caleb's mother. I've seen this happen 1,000 times. The extinction burst. It's a psychological term for what happens when a behavior that's been reinforced for years suddenly stops getting a reward. The person doesn't just give up, they ramp up the behavior. They scream louder, they cry harder, they create bigger crises, they do anything and everything to get that old reaction back. I warned Caleb that if he didn't stand firm during the extinction burst, he would be trapped forever. They both signed. Caleb's hand was steady, but Elena's was shaking. As they walked off the stage, I watched them through the monitors in the back. They didn't walk together. For the first time in years, there was a physical and emotional distance between them. Elena went to her car, and Caleb went to the transport van we had waiting to take him to a sober living and transitional facility, not because he was an addict, but because he needed a structured environment where he could learn how to be an adult without his mother's shadow looming over him. The first few weeks were brutal. My staff kept me updated on their progress. Elena called the facility 14 times in the first 48 hours. She told them she had important medical documents for Caleb. She told them his allergies were acting up and he needed a specific kind of pillow. She even tried to show up at the front gate claiming she was just passing by. But the staff there followed the protocol we'd set. They told her that Caleb was in a blackout period and wasn't taking visitors or calls. I spoke to Elena on the phone during a follow-up session about 3 weeks in. She sounded like a different person and not in a good way. Her voice was shrill and frantic. She told me I was destroying her family and that Caleb was miserable and begging to come home. I knew that wasn't true because I just talked to his counselor. Caleb was actually thriving. He'd gotten a job at a local hardware store. He was waking up at 6 a.m., making his own bed, and for the first time in his life, he was making his own decisions. I told Elena, stop. Just stop. You're not talking about Caleb's misery. You're talking about your own. You're bored. You're lonely. And you're trying to use your son as a cure for your boredom. Go find a hobby, go volunteer at a hospital, go join a book club. Do something that doesn't involve monitoring another human being's every move. It was harsh, but sometimes you have to perform surgery with a hacksaw when the infection is that deep. The real test came about 2 months later. Caleb had saved up enough money for a deposit on a tiny studio apartment. He was proud of it. He'd bought a used couch and a set of mismatched plates. He invited Elena over for a housewarming dinner, just 1 hour, in a public place near his apartment. He wanted to show her he was okay. He wanted to show her he could be her son without being her servant. Elena showed up, but she didn't come alone. She brought a bag of groceries, a new set of curtains, and a list of suggestions for how he should organize his life. Within 10 minutes, she was in his kitchen, moving things around, telling him the neighborhood wasn't safe, and asking him when he was going to stop playing house and come back to the real world. In the past, Caleb would have exploded. He would have started screaming. She would have started filming, and the whole cycle would have started over. But this time, something was different. Caleb didn't yell. He didn't even get angry. He just walked over to the door, opened it, and said, "Mom, I love you, but you're overstepping. If you can't sit down and have dinner without trying to run my life, then you need to leave. We can try again in a month." Elena was stunned. She tried the old tricks. She put her hand over her heart and said she felt dizzy. She started to cry. She told him he was cruel and ungrateful. But Caleb just stood there holding the door open. He didn't engage with the drama. He didn't take the bait. He just repeated, "I love you, but you need to go now." She eventually left fuming. She called my office the next day, sobbing that Caleb had kicked her out onto the street. But when I talked to Caleb, he sounded stronger than I'd ever heard him. He told me, "Doctor, Phil, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was drowning. I felt like I was standing on solid ground. I realized that her feelings aren't my responsibility. My responsibility is to be a man." That is the outcome that doesn't make it into the highlight reels. It's not a big emotional hug and a happily ever after. It's the slow, painful process of two people learning how to exist without destroying each other. It's about setting a boundary and holding it, even when it hurts. Over the next 6 months, the dynamic began to shift. Elena realized that if she wanted any part of Caleb's life, she had to play by his rules. She started going to her own therapy sessions, finally addressing the trauma of her husband leaving and her own mother's coldness. She began to realize that she had been using Caleb as a shield against the world. Slowly, very slowly, she started to build a life of her own. She started gardening. She joined a walking group. She even went on a date, her first in 15 years. Caleb stayed in his studio apartment. He got a promotion at work. He started dating a girl who didn't know anything about his volatile past. He told me that sometimes he still felt the urge to call his mom and ask for her opinion on things, but he was learning to trust his own gut instead. He was learning that he didn't need her permission to be happy. About a year after they first sat on my stage, I decided to do a follow-up. I wanted to see if the work they'd done in the trenches had actually taken root or if they'd slid back into those old, comfortable patterns of chaos. Change is hard, and it's even harder when the person you're changing for is the same person who knows exactly which buttons to push to make you fall apart. Elena had been through a lot of individual therapy, and so had Caleb. I sat down in my office and pulled up their latest reports, curious to see if the extinction burst I'd warned them about had finally leveled off into something resembling peace. The first thing I noticed was Caleb's photo in the progress report. He didn't look like that slumped, defeated kid anymore. His shoulders were back, his eyes were clear, and he wasn't wearing that oversized hoodie like a suit of armor. He had actually completed a management training program at the hardware store where he started as a clerk. But more importantly, he'd been living on his own for 14 months without a single eruption that required a call to the police or a trip to the emergency room. He was paying his own rent, managing his own schedule, and for the first time in his adult life, he wasn't looking over his shoulder for his mother's approval. Then I looked at Elena's file. It was a bit more of a mixed bag, which is usually the case with the enabler in these dynamics. She'd had several relapses into her old behavior. She'd tried to guilt trip him during the first Thanksgiving they spent apart, and there was one recorded incident where she'd called his boss to check on his progress, which nearly got Caleb fired. But the real breakthrough wasn't that Elena had suddenly stopped being Elena. The breakthrough was how Caleb handled it. He didn't scream. He didn't punch a door. He didn't give her the reaction she was fishing for. Instead, he quietly called his mother and told her that because she had violated his professional boundary, he wouldn't be speaking to her for the next 30 days. And the most impressive part, he stuck to it. He didn't answer her text, he didn't pick up her calls, and he didn't cave when she sent his aunt to check on him. That's the outcome I'm always looking for. It's not about the other person changing, it's about you changing the way you respond to them. Caleb had finally realized that he couldn't control his mother's anxiety or her need for dominance, but he could absolutely control his access to it. He had stopped being a participant in her drama. When you stop playing the part, the play has to close. He told his counselor that for the first time, he felt like he was wearing his own skin. He wasn't just a character in Elena's movie anymore. I think about that family often because they represent the invisible sabotage that happens in so many homes across this country. We see the kid who's acting out, the kid who's failing, the kid who's labeled as the problem, and we forget to look at the person who's holding the remote control. We forget that some parents would rather have a broken child who stays than a whole child who leaves. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but it's the truth. Elena wasn't trying to be a villain. She was trying to survive her own fear of abandonment, but in doing so, she was killing her son's spirit. Elena eventually reached out to my producers for a final comment. She said something that stayed with me, something that showed she might actually be getting it. She said, "Doctor, Phil, I used to think that being a good mother meant being everything to my son. I thought if I wasn't involved in every second of his life, I was failing him. I realized I wasn't being a mother, I was being an anchor, and all I was doing was keeping him from sailing." That's a powerful insight for a woman who spent 2 decades convinced she was a martyr. It took losing her son's physical presence for her to finally gain his respect. As I close this file, I'm reminded that every story has 2 versions. There's the version people tell the world to protect their ego, and then there's the version that's actually happening behind closed doors. My job isn't to be a judge, it's to be a mechanic. I look at the machine, find the broken gears, and tell you how to fix them. But you're the one who has to get your hands dirty. Caleb and Elena got their hands dirty. They did the hard, ugly work of dismantling a 20-year-old toxic system and building something new in its place. It's not a perfect relationship now, it probably never will be, but it's an honest one. And in my book, honest is a hell of a lot better than perfect. You have to be willing to see the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, because the truth is the only thing that can set you free from a life you didn't choose.